The wrench didn't slip from my grease-stained fingers when Colonel Hartwell announced they were grounding me, but the metallic clang as it hit the hangar floor might as well have been my career shattering. There in front of the entire 347th Fighter Squadron at Crimson Ridge Air Base, with 30 pairs of eyes watching in stunned silence, my supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Bradley Thornton, stood beside the colonel with a smug expression that told me everything I needed to know about who had orchestrated this moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Effective immediately, Specialist Rivera. Colonel Hartwell's voice echoed through the cavernous hangar. You're being reassigned to ground equipment maintenance. Your security clearance for the F-22 Raptor program has been revoked pending a full investigation into the incident with Phoenix 7. The Phoenix 7 incident. That's what they were calling it now. As if my name, Specialist Elena Rivera, wasn't worth mentioning in connection with what had actually happened 3 days ago. As if the 26 hours I'd spent diagnosing and repairing the most advanced fighter jet in the U.S. Air Force arsenal was somehow a failure instead of a miracle. But as I looked at Lieutenant Commander Thornton's satisfied smirk and saw the mix of pity and relief in my fellow mechanics' faces, relief that it wasn't them being publicly humiliated, something strange happened. I smiled. My name is Elena Rivera, and I'm 31 years old. I've been working on aircraft engines since I was 16, helping my father in his crop dusting business in the wheat fields outside Millbrook, Kansas. To understand why I smiled at what should have been the most devastating moment of my military career, you need to know about the Phoenix 7 incident, about Lieutenant Commander Thornton, and about the recording device I'd been carrying in my pocket for the past 4 months. The 347th Fighter Squadron at Crimson Ridge had been my assignment for 2 years, ever since I graduated top of my class from the Air Force Technical School in Shepherd, Texas. I was one of only 3 female mechanics in a unit of 47, and the only one certified to work on the F-22's revolutionary Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines. It was a position I'd fought for, studied for, and earned through 12-hour shifts and weekend training sessions that left my hands permanently stained with hydraulic fluid and jet fuel. Lieutenant Commander Thornton had been my supervisor for 18 months, and from day one, he'd made it clear that he believed women had no place working on fighter jets. Not openly, of course, the military has policies about that sort of thing, but in the thousand small ways that make a hostile work environment, assigning me the worst shifts, questioning my work twice as thoroughly as anyone else's, and making sure I was excluded from the informal networks where real knowledge got shared. Rivera's good with engines, I'd overheard him telling another supervisor 6 months ago, but she doesn't have the instincts for combat aircraft, too emotional, too cautious. These birds need someone who understands their warrior spirit. The other mechanics had learned to stay neutral. They weren't cruel, but they weren't allies either. In a place where your life depends on the person next to you, being different isn't just lonely, it's dangerous. So they watched from the sidelines as Thornton systematically tried to undermine my confidence and credibility. But 3 days ago, everything changed. Phoenix 7, one of our newest F-22 Raptors, had developed what the diagnostic computers called a catastrophic engine failure during a routine training exercise. The pilot, Captain Diana Wu, had managed to land the aircraft safely, but the engine was completely dead. According to the initial assessment, it would need to be shipped back to Lockheed Martin for a complete rebuild, a process that would take 6 months and cost the taxpayers approximately $14 million. The incident happened on a Friday afternoon, and Lieutenant Commander Thornton had already made plans to leave for the weekend. Tag it for shipment, he'd told the day shift supervisor. Nothing we can do here, but I stayed. Not because I was assigned to, but because something about the failure report didn't make sense. The engine had been performing perfectly during Pre-flight checks and catastrophic failures in F-119 engines were virtually unheard of. These weren't the crop-dusting engines I'd grown up with. But metal and physics work the same way whether you're flying over Kansas, wheat fields, or patrolling the airspace over Allied nations. I spent that entire weekend in the hangar, pulling apart the engine piece by piece, tracing every system, every connection, every component. The other mechanics thought I was crazy. "Rivera's obsessed," I heard one of them say. "She thinks she's going to find something the computers missed." They were right. I was obsessed. Because I'd found something the computers had missed: a tiny fragment of metal, barely visible to the naked eye, lodged in the fuel injection system. It wasn't engine failure. It was sabotage. Someone had deliberately damaged Phoenix 7. And they'd done it in a way that would make it look like a manufacturing defect. By Sunday evening, I hadn't just identified the problem, I'd fixed it. Not with a $14 million rebuild, but with $63 worth of replacement parts and 37 hours of the most precise mechanical work I'd ever done. When I fired up that engine for the first time after the repair, the sound it made was like music. Perfect, powerful, and ready to protect American airspace. I should have been a hero. I should have been commended for saving the Air Force millions of dollars and keeping a critical aircraft in service. Instead, Lieutenant Commander Thornton had spent the past 3 days questioning my competence, my judgment, and my right to even touch the aircraft. Specialist Rivera exceeded her authority, he'd written in his report. By attempting repairs beyond her skill level, she potentially compromised the safety of the aircraft and any pilot who might fly it. The investigation he demanded wasn't about the quality of my work. It was about making sure I never got the chance to prove my worth again. And now, standing in front of the entire squadron, he was getting his wish. But Lieutenant Commander Thornton had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I was just another mechanic who would quietly accept defeat. He didn't know about the recording device, the evidence I'd been collecting, or the real reason Phoenix 7 had been sabotaged in the first place. As Colonel Hartwell dismissed the formation and the other mechanics began filing out of the hangar, avoiding eye contact with me, I kept smiling. Because in exactly 30 minutes, when the colonel's next meeting began, everything was going to change. Sometimes the greatest professional betrayals lead to the greatest victories. And sometimes, the people who underestimate you give you exactly the opportunity you need to prove them catastrophically wrong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand why I wasn't devastated by Colonel Hartwell's announcement, you need to know about my journey to Crimson Ridge Air Base and the two people who shaped everything that happened next. My father, Miguel Rivera, and my unlikely ally, Technical Sergeant Zoe Blackstone. I wasn't born into a military family. My father owned Rivera Aviation Services, a small crop dusting operation that served the farming communities scattered across central Kansas. Our hangar was a converted barn outside Millbrook, population 847, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival. But that humble barn was where I learned that engines don't lie. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. My father had served as a crew chief on C-130 Hercules aircraft during the Gulf War, and he brought that military precision to everything he did. By the time I was 12, I could identify the sound of a failing cylinder from across a field. By 16, I was rebuilding Pratt & Whitney R985 radial engines that were older than my father. These weren't the sophisticated turbofan engines that power fighter jets, but the fundamental principles were the same: air, fuel, compression, combustion. Elena mia, my father would say as we worked side by side in the oil-stained coveralls. That became my second skin. People will always underestimate you. They'll see a young woman covered in grease and assume you're just playing around. But engines don't care about your gender or your age. They only care about your skill. Let your work speak louder than their assumptions. He died when I was 23, killed in a crash when an engine he'd serviced failed during takeoff. The investigation revealed that another mechanic had improperly installed a fuel line after my father's work was complete. But the damage was done. Rivera Aviation Services died with him, and I was left with a choice: let his legacy end, or prove that his daughter could carry on his dedication to mechanical excellence. The Air Force gave me that chance. Basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, followed by technical school at Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas, where one specialized in fighter aircraft propulsion systems. I graduated second in my class. The only reason I wasn't first was because I'd spent extra time helping struggling classmates instead of focusing solely on my own performance. My first assignment was to the 23rd Fighter Wing at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia, where I worked on a 10 Thunderbolt II aircraft. The A-10 is a tough, reliable close-air support aircraft that can take incredible punishment and keep flying. Working on those planes taught me that military aircraft aren't just machines. They're lifelines for the people who depend on them. I spent 3 years at Moody, earning my 5-level certification and building a reputation as someone who could diagnose problems that stumped other mechanics. When the opportunity came to apply for F-22 Raptor training, I was the only enlisted member from my squadron selected for the program. The F-22 Raptor is the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. Its twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines produce 35,000 pounds of thrust each and can push the aircraft to speeds exceeding Mach 2. The entire plane is a masterpiece of engineering, from its stealth coating to its advanced avionics systems. Working on F-22s isn't just a job, it's a privilege reserved for the most skilled mechanics in the Air Force. That's what brought me to Crimson Ridge Air Base in Nevada, home to the 347th Fighter Squadron. The base sits in the middle of the Mojave Desert, surrounded by mountains that turn purple at sunset and endless blue skies, perfect for testing the limits of human engineering. It should have been the culmination of everything I'd worked for. Instead, it became a battlefield. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Thornton was a 20-year veteran who'd worked his way up from enlisted ranks to become one of the most senior maintenance supervisors in the Air Force. On paper, he was impressive. Multiple commendations, experience with every fighter aircraft in the inventory, and a reputation for running efficient operations. In person, he was a different story. Thornton belonged to the old school of military thinking, where fighter squadrons were exclusive clubs for a certain type of person. He'd started his career when women weren't allowed in combat roles, and he'd never fully accepted that times had changed. He was too smart to say anything directly discriminatory, but his actions spoke volumes. During my first week at Crimson Ridge, he assigned me to work exclusively on ground support equipment fuel. Trucks, generators, air compressors. Important work, but not what I'd been trained for. When I asked about F-22 assignments, he told me I needed to prove myself on simpler systems first. That's when I met Technical Sergeant Zoe Blackstone. Zoe was a 15-year veteran who'd worked on everything from helicopters to bombers. She was African American, originally from Detroit, and had faced her own battles with discrimination during her career. But she'd also earned the respect of every mechanic on the base through sheer competence and an unwillingness to back down from difficult challenges. She found me in the hangar one evening, 3 months into my assignment, still working on ground equipment while the other mechanics were learning F-22 systems. "You're Rivera, right?" she said, pulling up a tool cart next to where I was rebuilding a hydraulic pump. "I've been watching you work. You're good, better than good. So why are you still playing with toys instead of working on real aircraft?" I looked up from the pump, surprised by her directness. "Lieutenant Commander Thornton says I need more experience with base systems first." Zoe laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Thornton's been saying that for how long now? 3 months? I've seen mechanics with half your skills get F-22 assignments in their first week. She leaned against the workbench, her expression serious. Look, I'm going to tell you something that might sound harsh, but you need to hear it. Thornton doesn't want you to succeed. He's hoping you'll get frustrated and request a transfer, or make a mistake he can use to justify removing you from the program. So what do? I asked. You document everything, she said. Every assignment, every conversation, every decision he makes about your career. And you become so good at your job that he can't ignore you anymore. That conversation changed everything. Zoe became my mentor, teaching me not just about F-22 systems, but about surviving in an environment where competence wasn't always enough. She showed me how to navigate the informal networks that really determined who got opportunities and who got overlooked. More importantly, she taught me about the politics of Fighter Squadron maintenance. The F-22 program was under constant scrutiny from Congress and the Pentagon. Every failure, every delay, every cost overrun was magnified by critics who questioned whether the aircraft was worth its enormous price tag. That political pressure created an environment where commanders were risk-averse, preferring to rely on proven personnel rather than take chances on newcomers, but it also created opportunities for someone willing to work harder and smarter than everyone else. Under Zoe's guidance, I began a systematic campaign to prove my worth. I volunteered for extra shifts, studied technical manuals during my off hours, and made myself indispensable for every aircraft maintenance task on the base. When other mechanics had questions about engine systems, they started coming to me for answers. Slowly, grudgingly, Lieutenant Commander Thornton began assigning me to more complex tasks. First, routine maintenance on F-22 engines. Then diagnostic work. Finally, after 8 months of proving myself, I received my certification to work independently on Raptor propulsion systems. That's when I discovered I had a gift that went beyond technical training. I could hear things in jet engines that other mechanics missed: subtle changes in vibration, minute variations in temperature, tiny anomalies that might indicate future problems. It was the same intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that my father had possessed, refined through years of working on increasingly sophisticated aircraft. The other mechanics began to notice. Captain Diana Wu, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, specifically requested me for pre-flight inspections on her aircraft. Rivera has a sixth sense for engine problems, she told Lieutenant Commander Thornton. If she says an engine sounds wrong, I trust her judgment completely. But my growing reputation also made me more of a threat to Thornton's authority. The better I became at my job, the more his initial assessment of my abilities looked like prejudice rather than professional judgment. And that's when he began looking for ways to undermine my credibility. The Phoenix 7 incident wasn't the first time he'd questioned my work, it was just the most public. For months, he'd been setting me up for failure, assigning me to aircraft with known problems, and then criticizing my diagnostic techniques when I identified issues that others had missed. What he didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything, just as Zoe had taught me. Every conversation, every assignment, every attempt to sabotage my career was recorded in a detailed log that I kept in my quarters. And starting 4 months ago, after a particularly unfair performance review, I'd begun carrying a small digital recorder to capture our interactions, because I'd learned something important during my time at Crimson Ridge in a system designed to protect those in power. Sometimes the only way to get justice is to gather evidence and wait for the right moment to present it. That moment was coming sooner than Lieutenant Commander Thornton realized. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks before the Phoenix 7 incident, during what should have been a routine maintenance inspection on Thunder 5, another F-22 in our squadron. I was performing a scheduled engine examination when I noticed something that made blood run cold. Microscopic metal shavings in the oil filter that shouldn't have been there. Metal shavings in jet engine oil can indicate catastrophic internal damage, the kind that can cause an engine to fail at 30,000 feet and kill a pilot. But when I brought my findings to Lieutenant Commander Thornton, his reaction was unlike anything I'd experienced before. "Those are normal wear particles, Rivera," he said dismissively, barely glancing at the filter sample I'd carefully extracted and labeled. "You're seeing problems that don't exist." "Sir, with respect, I've never seen particles this size or configuration in a healthy engine," I persisted. "The edges are too sharp, too uniform. This looks like deliberate scoring of internal components." Thornton's face darkened. "Are you suggesting that someone deliberately damaged a multi-million-dollar fighter aircraft? That's a serious accusation, Specialist. I'm suggesting we need to investigate further before clearing this aircraft for flight," I replied carefully. "If there's internal damage we haven't identified, it could result in catastrophic failure." That's when Thornton made a decision that should have ended my concerns, but instead amplified them. "I'll handle the investigation personally," he said, taking the oil sample from my hands. "You're to make no mention of this to anyone else. That's an order." I never saw that oil sample again. When I asked about it 2 days later, Thornton told me the laboratory had found nothing unusual. Thunder 5 was cleared for flight that same afternoon, and I watched from the hangar as Captain Rodriguez took it up for a training exercise, my stomach churning with anxiety. The aircraft returned safely, but my unease remained. I'd been working on aircraft engines for 15 years, and I knew the difference between normal wear and deliberate damage. Those metal shavings were evidence of sabotage, and Lieutenant Commander Thornton had covered it up. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I began keeping a second set of records that my official maintenance logs continued to follow standard Air Force procedures, documenting only what I was authorized to include. But my personal logs became something different, a detailed account of every anomaly I discovered, every suspicious order I received, and every instance where my professional judgment was overruled without adequate explanation. The pattern became clear within days. Aircraft that I flagged for additional inspection were hastily cleared for flight. Maintenance procedures that should have taken hours were compressed into minutes when certain pilots were scheduled to fly. And always Lieutenant Commander Thornton was involved in the decision-making process. Technical Sergeant Zoe Blackstone noticed my growing tension during our regular Friday evening training sessions. We'd started meeting weekly in the hangar after hours, where she taught me advanced diagnostic techniques, and I shared what I'd learned about F-22 systems. These sessions had become the highlight of my week, a chance to discuss aircraft maintenance with someone who respected my abilities and pushed me to improve. "You've been quiet lately," Zoe observed as we worked together on a training engine that had been designated for instructional use. "Something bothering you about the job?" I hesitated. Thornton's order to keep quiet about the Thunder 5 incident was still fresh in my mind, but Zoe had earned my trust over months of mentorship and support. "Hypothetically," I said carefully, "if you discovered evidence of potential sabotage on an aircraft and your supervisor ordered you to keep quiet about it, what would you do?" Zoe's hands stilled on the wrench she'd been using. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part concern, part calculation, part fear. "Hypothetically," she replied slowly, "I'd want to be very sure of my facts before making accusations like that. But I'd also want to be very sure that pilots weren't flying compromised aircraft. And if your supervisor was part of the problem, then I'd document everything and wait for an opportunity to present the evidence to someone who could act on it." That conversation confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed irregularities in our maintenance procedures. Zoe's careful responses suggested she'd been harboring her own concerns, but hadn't found a way to address them through normal channels. Over the following weeks, I expanded my documentation efforts. Using my personal smartphone, I began photographing evidence that I wasn't allowed to retain officially, oil samples, diagnostic readouts, and maintenance schedules that showed suspicious patterns. I recorded conversations when possible, always careful to stay within legal boundaries while building a comprehensive record of what was happening in our hangar. The breakthrough came during a late-night maintenance session on Phantom 3, an F-22 that had been experiencing intermittent engine irregularities. I was alone in the hangar, working under emergency lighting to minimize disruption to daytime operations, when I discovered something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. Hidden beneath an access panel that should have contained only standard wiring, I found a small electronic device that didn't belong there. It was roughly the size of a smartphone battery, with tiny leads connected to the engine's diagnostic system. The device was sophisticated, clearly military grade, and absolutely unauthorized. Someone had installed a remote override system in the aircraft's engine controls. The implications were staggering. This wasn't random sabotage. It was a coordinated effort to compromise multiple aircraft in ways that would appear to be mechanical failures. Someone with access to classified technology and detailed knowledge of F-22 systems was systematically undermining the readiness of our squadron. I photographed the device from every angle, documenting its placement and connections before carefully removing it for further analysis. The device's circuit board bore markings that I didn't recognize, but its sophistication suggested it had been manufactured by someone with significant resources and technical expertise. As I worked, pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place. The metal shavings in Thunder 5's oil filter hadn't been caused by sabotage. They'd been caused by this type of device forcing the engine to operate outside normal parameters. The hasty clearances for aircraft I'd flagged for inspection made sense if someone was trying to hide evidence of similar devices. And Lieutenant Commander Thornton's behavior suggested he was either complicit in the scheme or being manipulated by someone who was. The question was, who was behind it and why? I spent the rest of that night researching the device I'd found, using the base's technical library and my own knowledge of military electronics to understand its capabilities. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I'd imagined. The override system was designed to gradually degrade engine performance over time, creating failures that would appear to be manufacturing defects or maintenance errors. A pilot experiencing engine trouble would naturally blame mechanical problems, not sabotage. Investigation teams would focus on identifying what had gone wrong with the aircraft, not who had deliberately caused the failure. But the most chilling aspect of the device was its remote activation capability. Someone could trigger engine failures from a distance, potentially during combat operations or training exercises. The Phoenix 7 incident suddenly took on new significance. Had Captain Wu's engine been remotely disabled, turning what should have been a routine training flight into a near disaster? Over the next 2 weeks, I found similar devices in 3 more aircraft. Each discovery was carefully documented and photographed before I removed the device and secured it in a locked box in my quarters. I also began tracking the pattern of when these devices were installed, cross-referencing maintenance schedules with personnel assignments to identify who had access to the aircraft during the relevant time periods. The pattern that emerged was disturbing but clear. The devices were always installed during overnight maintenance shifts, when minimal supervision was present and individual mechanics worked alone on specific aircraft. They were placed by someone with intimate knowledge of F-22 systems and access to sophisticated electronics, and they were being coordinated by someone with the authority to modify maintenance schedules and override safety protocols. Lieutenant Commander Thornton fit the profile perfectly, but I was beginning to suspect he wasn't working alone. The final piece of evidence came during a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. I was working late in the hangar, hidden behind the bulk of an aircraft engine, when Thornton entered with someone I didn't immediately recognize. Their voices carried clearly in the empty space, and what I heard confirmed my worst fears. "The timeline has been moved up," the stranger said in a voice I didn't recognize but would never forget. "Washington wants to see results within the next month." "That doesn't give us much time," Thornton replied. "Rivera's been getting too close to the truth. She found one of the devices. Then maybe it's time to discredit her permanently. A major maintenance error that compromises aircraft safety. That would end her career and discredit any evidence she might have gathered." "Phoenix 7 is scheduled for a training exercise next week," Thornton said thoughtfully. "If the engine were to fail during flight, perfect. Make sure Rivera is assigned to the pre-flight inspection. When the engine fails, it will look like she missed a critical problem." I remained hidden until they left, my heart pounding as I realized the full scope of what I'd uncovered. This wasn't just about sabotaging aircraft, it was about destroying the F-22 program itself. Someone wanted the most advanced fighter jet in the world to appear unreliable, dangerous, and unworthy of continued investment, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the mechanic they were trying to frame. As I sat in the dark hangar that night, surrounded by the aircraft I dedicated my career to maintaining, I began planning my response. I had evidence of the sabotage, recordings of the conversations, and detailed documentation of the conspiracy. But I also had something more valuable, the knowledge of exactly when and how they planned to strike next. Phoenix 7 was going to be their masterpiece, a catastrophic engine failure that would appear to be caused by my incompetence. They would destroy my career while advancing their larger goal of undermining confidence in the F-22 program. What they didn't know was that I was ready for them. The morning of the Phoenix 7 incident arrived with the kind of crystal clear desert sky that made the F-22 Raptor look like it belonged among the clouds. I reported for duty at 0600 hours, knowing that this would be the day everything came to a head. Lieutenant Commander Thornton had scheduled me for the pre-flight inspection on Phoenix 7, exactly as I'd overheard him planning 2 weeks earlier. What he didn't know was that I'd spent every night since then preparing for this moment. The squadron's daily briefing took place in the main hangar at 0630, with all 47 maintenance personnel gathered around the central work area where assignments were distributed. Colonel Hartwell typically attended these briefings when important operations were scheduled, and today was no exception. Phoenix 7 was slated for an advanced maneuvering exercise that would push the aircraft to its operational limits, exactly the kind of high-stress mission where an engine failure would be most catastrophic. "Today's assignments," Lieutenant Commander Thornton announced, consulting his clipboard with theatrical precision, "are designed to ensure maximum efficiency and safety. We have several critical missions scheduled, and I want our best people on our most important aircraft." He began reading the list, and I noticed how carefully he'd arranged the personnel assignments. The most experienced mechanics were assigned to routine maintenance tasks, while newer personnel were given responsibility for aircraft scheduled for training flights. It was a subtle but deliberate reversal of normal protocol, designed to create confusion and provide cover for what was about to happen. "Phoenix 7 will be inspected by Specialist Rivera," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hangar. "Captain Wu is scheduled for a high-G maneuvering exercise at 1100 hours. So we need thorough but efficient inspection protocols." I saw Captain Wu standing near the flight line entrance, already dressed in her flight suit and reviewing mission parameters on a tablet. She was one of the squadron's most skilled pilots, with over 2,000 hours in F-22 aircraft and a reputation for pushing the Raptor to its absolute limits. If someone wanted to create a spectacular failure that would generate maximum publicity and concern, Captain Wu's mission was the perfect opportunity. "Understood, sir," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'll begin the inspection immediately." As the briefing dispersed and mechanics moved to their assigned aircraft, Technical Sergeant Zoe Blackstone approached me with a concerned expression. Over the past 2 weeks, I'd shared enough of my discoveries with her to make her understand the gravity of the situation, though I'd kept the most sensitive details to myself for her own protection. "Elena," she said quietly, "be extra careful. Today, something about this assignment feels wrong." "I know," I replied, checking that my personal recording device was active and properly concealed. "But sometimes the only way to expose the truth is to let the trap spring and be ready for it." Phoenix 7 sat in Hangar Bay 3, its angular stealth profile making it look more like a piece of abstract sculpture than a machine of war. The aircraft's gray finish absorbed the morning light, giving it an almost otherworldly appearance that never failed to impress me. Even knowing what I was about to discover, I felt a surge of pride at being trusted to work on such an incredible piece of engineering. The pre-flight inspection protocol for an F-22 is exhaustive, covering every system, from the pilot's ejection seat to the aircraft's sophisticated radar arrays. But today, I knew exactly where to focus my attention. The sabotage device would be installed in the engine compartment, hidden among the maze of cables and components that make the F-119 turbofan engine the most powerful fighter aircraft propulsion system ever built. I began with the standard exterior inspection, checking control surfaces, landing gear, and external sensors, while gradually working my way toward the engine access panels. Other mechanics worked on nearby aircraft, their conversations and tool sounds providing a backdrop of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the tension I felt building in my chest. "Rivera," Lieutenant Commander Thornton's voice carried across the hangar as he approached Phoenix 7. "How's the inspection progressing?" "Proceeding normally, sir," I replied, not looking up from the engine compartment where I was conducting what appeared to be a routine systems check. "All external systems show green, and I'm beginning internal diagnostics now." "Good, Captain. Wu wants to be airborne by 1100, so we need to maintain our schedule." I nodded and continued working, aware that Thornton was watching my every move. This was the critical moment. He needed to see me discover the sabotage device and either miss its significance or fail to report it properly. Either outcome would provide him with the evidence he needed to blame me for the subsequent engine failure. What he didn't expect was for me to be prepared at 0945 hours, exactly 90 minutes before Captain Wu's scheduled takeoff. I found what I was looking for. Hidden behind the primary fuel control unit, precisely where my research had indicated it would be, was another of the sophisticated override devices. This one was slightly different from the others I discovered, more complex, with additional circuitry that suggested it was designed for more dramatic failures. "Sir," I called out to Lieutenant Commander Thornton, my voice carrying the note of confusion that he would expect from a mechanic who had discovered something she didn't understand. "Could you take a look at this? I found something unusual in the engine compartment." Thornton approached with an expression of professional concern that I now recognized as completely false. Behind him, I noticed that several other personnel were also moving closer, not because they were particularly interested in my discovery, but because Thornton had clearly arranged for witnesses to be present for this moment. "What seems to be the problem, specialist?" he asked, leaning over my shoulder to examine the device I was pointing to. "This component isn't in any of the technical manuals I've studied," I said, maintaining the pretense that I was genuinely puzzled. "It appears to be connected to the engine control system, but I can't identify its function." Thornton studied the device with theatrical intensity, as if he were seeing it for the first time. "That's a secondary monitoring system," he said finally. "It's part of a new upgrade package that's being tested fleet-wide. Nothing to be concerned about." "But sir," I persisted, "shouldn't modifications like this be documented in the maintenance logs? And why isn't it mentioned in the pre-flight inspection checklist?" This was the moment when Thornton's careful plan began to unravel. He'd expected me to either miss the device entirely or to accept his explanation without question. My continued questioning was forcing him to provide details about a fictional upgrade program that didn't exist. "The upgrade is classified," he said, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "You don't have the security clearance to access that information. Your job is to follow inspection protocols, not to question systems you don't understand." "I understand, sir," I replied, "but if this is a classified modification, shouldn't there be a notation in the maintenance records indicating that classified components are present? That's standard protocol for any aircraft carrying sensitive equipment." By now, several other mechanics had gathered around Phoenix 7, drawn by the unusual nature of our conversation. Among them was Technical Sergeant Blackstone, who was watching the exchange with growing interest, and Staff Sergeant Murphy, one of the squadron's most experienced engine specialists. "Rivera," Thornton said, his voice now clearly showing strain, "you're overthinking this. The device is authorized, it's properly installed, and it poses no safety risk to the aircraft. Clear the inspection and prep the aircraft for flight." This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the point where Thornton would order me to ignore a potential safety issue and clear the aircraft for a mission that he knew would result in engine failure. With multiple witnesses present and my recording device capturing every word, I had him exactly where I needed him. "Sir," I said, my voice taking on the formal tone required for serious disagreements with superior officers, "I cannot in good conscience clear this aircraft for flight without proper documentation of all installed systems. If this device is authorized, then there should be paperwork supporting its installation. If it's not authorized, then its presence represents a serious security breach that could compromise the safety of the pilot and the mission." The hangar had grown noticeably quieter as other mechanics sensed the tension in our conversation. This wasn't the usual back and forth between supervisor and technician. This was a direct challenge to Thornton's authority, witnessed by nearly half the squadron. "Are you refusing to follow a direct order, Specialist Rivera?" Thornton asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable threat of court-martial proceedings. "I'm requesting proper documentation before clearing an aircraft for flight," I replied steadily. "That's not refusing orders, that's following Air Force safety protocols." Staff Sergeant Murphy stepped closer to examine the device I'd discovered. As one of the squadron's most senior enlisted personnel, his opinion carried significant weight with both the mechanics and the officers who supervised them. "I've never seen this component before," he said after a careful examination. "And I've been working on F-22 since the program started. If this is a fleet-wide upgrade, where are the technical bulletins? Where's the training documentation?" "Lieutenant." Commander Thornton's face was beginning to show the strain of maintaining his deception under increasing scrutiny. The careful plan that had seemed so foolproof in private conversation was collapsing under the weight of basic military protocol and professional skepticism. "This conversation is over," he announced. "Rivera, you will clear this aircraft for flight immediately, or you will face disciplinary action for insubordination." But it was too late for threats. Word of the unusual device had spread through the hangar, and mechanics from other work areas were gathering to see what had caused such an unusual confrontation. Among them was Captain Diana Wu herself, who had arrived early for her mission briefing and overheard the argument about her aircraft. "What exactly is the problem with Phoenix 7? She asked, her voice carrying the absolute authority that comes with being responsible for flying a machine worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. And that's when Lieutenant Commander Thornton made the mistake that would expose everything. Captain. Diana Wu's question hung in the air like the tension before a thunderstorm. Here was the pilot whose life depended on the aircraft we were arguing about, asking for a straight answer about what was wrong with her machine. Lieutenant Commander Thornton had seconds to respond, And whatever he said would determine whether his conspiracy continued or collapsed completely. "There's no problem with the aircraft, Captain," Thornton said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Specialist Rivera has discovered a standard upgrade component and is unnecessarily questioning its authorization. The aircraft is fully mission-ready." Captain Wu looked between Thornton and me, her expression growing more serious as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. As a pilot, she understood better than anyone that disagreements about aircraft safety weren't academic debates. They were matters of life and death. "Show me," she said simply. I gestured toward the engine compartment where the unauthorized device was still visible. Captain Wu approached with the careful attention that all good pilots bring to examining their aircraft, studying the component that had caused such controversy. "I've never seen this before," she said after a long moment. "And I've been flying F-22s for 8 years. What is it?" This was the moment when Lieutenant Commander Thornton's careful deception finally cracked under pressure. Faced with a direct question from the pilot who would be risking her life in the aircraft, he couldn't maintain the fiction of authorized upgrades and classified modifications. "It's a monitoring device," he said, his voice betraying the first hints of uncertainty. "Part of a new data collection program." "What kind of data?" Captain Wu pressed. "Engine performance metrics, stress analysis, operational parameters." But Staff Sergeant Murphy was already shaking his head. "Sir, data collection systems don't require direct connection to engine control circuits. This device has leads going into the fuel management system and the electronic engine control unit. That's not monitoring, that's control capability." The implications of Murphy's observation rippled through the gathered mechanics like a shock wave. Everyone present understood what he was suggesting. The device wasn't just collecting information about the engine, it was capable of controlling it. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. Instead of backing down or waiting for someone else to take action, I stepped forward and addressed the growing crowd of personnel directly. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough to carry clearly across the hangar. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "what we're looking at here is an unauthorized device capable of remotely controlling critical engine functions on an F-22 Raptor. This device is not mentioned in any technical manual, is not documented in any maintenance log, and appears to be designed to cause catastrophic engine failure on command." The silence that followed my statement was deafening. 37 maintenance personnel, 3 officers, and 1 very concerned pilot stared at me as if I'd announced that aliens had landed on the flight line. Lieutenant Commander Thornton's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally desperate determination. "Specialist Rivera," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of military authority, "you are out of line. Stand down immediately." But I wasn't finished. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out my smartphone and displaying the photographs I'd taken over the previous weeks, "this is not an isolated incident. I have documented evidence of similar devices installed on Thunder 5, Phantom 3, and Eagle 7. Each device was discovered during routine maintenance and removed before it could cause operational failures." The crowd pressed closer too. "See the photographs," and I heard sharp intakes of breath as experienced mechanics recognized what they were looking at. These weren't theoretical threats. They were real devices that had been installed on aircraft that pilots flew every day. "I also have recorded conversations," I continued, maintaining eye contact with Lieutenant Commander Thornton, documenting plans to use today's engine failure to discredit the F-22 program and destroy my career as a scapegoat. Captain Wu stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmur of voices that had begun among the gathered personnel. "Are you telling me that someone has been deliberately sabotaging our aircraft?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "And they planned to use Phoenix 7's mission today to create a catastrophic failure that would appear to be caused by maintenance error." That's when Technical Sergeant Zoe Blackstone made her move. I'd shared enough information with her over the past weeks that she understood the full scope of what was happening, and she'd been waiting for exactly this moment to act. "Colonel Hartwell needs to hear this immediately," she announced, pulling out her radio. "This is Technical Sergeant Blackstone, requesting immediate command presence in Hangar Bay 3. We have a critical security situation involving potential sabotage of aircraft." Lieutenant Commander Thornton tried one last desperate gambit to regain control of the situation. "Sergeant Blackstone, belay that transmission. This is a maintenance issue that can be resolved through normal channels." But Zoe was already speaking into her radio. "Colonel Hartwell, this is an emergency. We need you in Hangar Bay 3 immediately. We have evidence of deliberate sabotage of F-22 aircraft and possible conspiracy involving squadron personnel." The response came back immediately. "Acknowledged. Seal the hangar. No one enters or leaves until I arrive. Security police are en route." And that's when I smiled. It wasn't a reaction anyone expected. Lieutenant Commander Thornton had anticipated tears, anger, or at least fear as his plan destroyed my career. The gathered mechanics expected continued confrontation and escalating tension. Even Captain Wu seemed surprised by my calm demeanor in the face of such serious accusations. But I smiled because I knew something that one else in that hangar understood. This wasn't the end of my career, it was the beginning of justice. Over the past month, I hadn't just been collecting evidence of the sabotage devices. I'd been building a comprehensive case that extended far beyond Lieutenant Commander Thornton's involvement. The sophisticated electronics, the coordination required to install devices across multiple aircraft, and the apparent goal of discrediting the F-22 program suggested a conspiracy that reached much higher than a Fighter single maintenance supervisor. I'd traced the supply chain for the unauthorized devices, identified patterns in personnel assignments that corresponded with installation times, and discovered financial connections that painted a picture of a deliberate effort to undermine American air superiority. The evidence I'd gathered wasn't just enough to stop today's sabotage. It was enough to expose an entire network of individuals working to compromise national security. "Specialist Rivera," Captain Wu said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "If what you're saying is true, then you've potentially saved not just my life, but the entire F-22 program." "Ma'am," I replied, "what I'm saying is absolutely true. And it's about to get much more interesting." The sound of approaching footsteps announced Colonel Hartwell's arrival, accompanied by a team of security police who immediately began securing the area. But before they could begin their investigation, I had one more revelation that would shock everyone present. "Colonel," I said as he approached Phoenix 7, "before you begin questioning personnel about this sabotage, you should know that Lieutenant Commander Thornton wasn't working alone." I pulled out a small digital recorder that I'd kept hidden throughout the confrontation. "I have recordings of conversations between Lieutenant Commander Thornton and an unidentified individual discussing the timeline for discrediting the F-22 program and eliminating me as a threat to their operation." Colonel Hartwell's expression hardened as he realized the implications of what I was saying. "Are you telling me this is espionage?" "Sir," I replied, "I'm telling you that someone wanted the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world to appear unreliable and dangerous. They were willing to risk pilot lives and compromise national security to achieve that goal. And they made the mistake of underestimating a mechanic from Kansas who learned to listen to what engines are really telling her." As security police began separating personnel for individual questioning and Colonel Hartwell started examining the evidence I'd collected, Lieutenant Commander Thornton made one final attempt to salvage his position. "This is all speculation and circumstantial evidence," he announced desperately. "Rivera has been unstable for months, obsessed with imaginary problems and conspiracy theories. She's trying to cover up her own incompetence by making wild accusations, but it was too late for damage control. The evidence was too comprehensive, the witnesses too numerous, and the implications too serious for dismissal. As I watched security police place restraints on Lieutenant Commander Thornton's wrists, I realized that my father had been right about one thing: engines don't lie, and neither does the truth when you have the courage to speak it. The investigation that followed would reveal connections to foreign intelligence services, financial incentives that reached into the millions of dollars, and a conspiracy that had targeted multiple critical defense programs. But all of that was still to come. For now, standing in Hangar Bay 3 surrounded by the aircraft I dedicated my career to protecting, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The trap that was supposed to destroy me had instead exposed the real threat to American aviation. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding confrontation, but from walking directly into it, with absolute confidence in your preparation and principles. The transformation in Colonel Hartwell's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. 5 minutes earlier, he'd been preparing to discipline me for what appeared to be insubordination and conspiracy theories. Now, as he examined the sophisticated sabotage device in Phoenix 7's engine compartment and listened to portions of my recorded conversations, his expression shifted from skepticism to grim determination. "Sergeant Blackstone," he ordered, "coordinate with security police to establish a complete perimeter around this hangar. No one enters or leaves without my personal authorization. Captain Rodriguez, contact Wing Command immediately and request an emergency stand-down of all F-22 operations until further notice." The implications of that order rippled through the assembled personnel like an earthquake. A complete stand-down of F-22 operations at Crimson Ridge meant grounding the most advanced fighter squadron in the Air Force, based solely on my evidence and accusations. It was either a vindication of everything I'd discovered or the end of my military career if I was wrong. But I wasn't wrong, and the evidence I'd spent weeks collecting was about to prove that beyond any doubt. "Specialist Rivera," Colonel Hartwell said, turning his full attention to me for the first time since arriving in the hangar, "I need you to brief me on everything you've discovered, starting from the beginning. And I mean everything. No detail is too small, no observation too minor." I pulled out the locked case I'd brought with me that morning, the one that contained the physical evidence I'd been collecting for weeks. Inside were the 4 sabotage devices I'd removed from other aircraft, detailed photographs of their installation, locations, technical analysis of their circuitry, and copies of all my documentation. "Sir," I began, setting the case on a nearby work table, "what we're looking at is a systematic campaign to compromise the operational readiness and safety record of the F-22 Raptor program. The devices are sophisticated military-grade electronics capable of remotely overriding critical engine functions." I opened the case and began displaying the contents methodically. Each device was labeled with the aircraft it had been removed from, the date of discovery, and detailed technical notes about its capabilities and installation method. These devices were installed during overnight maintenance shifts over the past 6 months, I continued. They're designed to gradually degrade engine performance, creating failures that would appear to be manufacturing defects or maintenance errors, but they also have the capability to cause immediate catastrophic failure on remote command. Colonel Hartwell examined each device carefully, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "How did you discover them?" "The first indication was unusual metal shavings in Thunder 5's oil filter 3 weeks ago. When I reported it to Lieutenant Commander Thornton, he confiscated the evidence and ordered me to remain silent about it. That's when I began keeping my own records and conducting independent investigations." I pulled out my smartphone and began displaying the comprehensive photographic evidence I'd compiled. Each device follows the same installation pattern, hidden behind standard access panels, connected to both the fuel management system and electronic engine controls, and placed in locations that would only be discovered during major maintenance overhauls. Technical Sergeant Blackstone stepped forward to examine the devices more closely. As one of the squadron's most experienced mechanics, her opinion would carry significant weight with Colonel Hartwell. "These aren't amateur modifications," she observed. "Whoever installed these had detailed knowledge of F-22 systems and access to classified technical manuals. The placement is too precise, the integration too sophisticated for anything but professional-level work." That's when I revealed the most damning piece of evidence I'd collected. "Sir," I said, pulling out the digital recorder that had captured Lieutenant Commander Thornton's conversations 3 days ago. I overheard a planning session between Lieutenant Commander Thornton and an unidentified individual. They discussed accelerating their timeline and using today's mission to create a catastrophic failure that would be blamed on my incompetence. I played back portions of the recording, and the silence in the hangar was absolute as everyone heard. Thornton's voice discussing the deliberate sabotage of Phoenix 7 and the plan to destroy my career as a cover story. "That doesn't give us much time," Thornton's recorded voice said clearly. "Rivera's been getting too close to the truth. She found one of the devices. Then maybe it's time to discredit her permanently," came the unidentified voice. "A major maintenance error that compromises aircraft safety that would end her career and discredit any evidence she might have gathered." Colonel Hartwell's face darkened as he listened to the recording. When it finished, he turned to the security police team leader who had been documenting everything. "Master Sergeant Williams," he ordered, "I want Lieutenant Commander Thornton isolated immediately. No contact with other personnel, no access to communications equipment, and no opportunity to destroy additional evidence." But the power dynamic in the hangar had shifted in ways that went far beyond Thornton's arrest. For months, I'd been treated as a junior mechanic whose opinions and observations were barely tolerated. Now I was the expert witness whose evidence was driving decisions that affected the entire F-22 program. "Specialist Rivera," Colonel Hartwell continued, "I'm placing you in charge of the technical investigation into these devices. You'll work directly with Air Force Office of Special Investigations and have full access to whatever resources you need." The transformation was immediate and visible. Mechanics who had avoided eye contact with me for months were now looking at me with expressions ranging from respect to amazement. Staff Sergeant Murphy, who had always been professional but distant, stepped forward with an offer of assistance. "Specialist Rivera," he said, "if you need help examining other aircraft for similar devices, I'd like to volunteer for the investigation team." One by one, other mechanics began volunteering to assist with the investigation. These were the same people who had watched Lieutenant Commander Thornton undermine my credibility for months without speaking up, but now they were eager to be associated with exposing the conspiracy. But the most significant shift came from Captain Diana Wu. "Specialist Rivera," she said, approaching me with an expression of genuine gratitude, "I want to personally thank you for potentially saving my life today. If that device had activated during high-G maneuvers, I might not have been able to recover the aircraft." "Ma'am," I replied, "protecting pilots and aircraft is what we're here for. I was just doing my job." "No," she said firmly, "you were doing much more than your job. You were willing to risk your career to expose a threat that could have killed multiple pilots and compromised national security. That takes courage that goes far beyond duty." As the investigation began to unfold around us, Colonel Hartwell pulled me aside for a private conversation that would change the trajectory of my entire career. "Specialist Rivera," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something directly. How long have you suspected that this conspiracy extended beyond Lieutenant Commander Thornton?" I'd been waiting for this question. The evidence I'd collected pointed to coordination and resources that went far beyond what a single maintenance supervisor could access. "Sir," I replied, "the sophistication of these devices and the coordination required to install them across multiple aircraft suggests involvement by individuals with access to classified technology and significant financial resources." "Lieutenant," Commander Thornton was implementing the plan, but he wasn't designing it. What do you think we're really dealing with here? Based on the technical capabilities of the devices and the apparent goal of discrediting the F-22 program, I believe we're looking at foreign intelligence operation designed to undermine American air superiority. The sabotage wasn't random, it was targeted specifically at our most advanced fighter aircraft. Colonel Hartwell nodded grimly. That's consistent with what I'm hearing from Wing Command. This investigation is about to become much larger than a single squadron. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the hangar. Through the open bay doors, I could see military aircraft that didn't belong to Crimson Ridge Air. Base aircraft with markings that indicated the arrival of personnel from much higher levels of the military hierarchy. Specialist Rivera, Colonel Hartwell said, watching the helicopters land. In about 10 minutes, you're going to be briefing some very senior people on everything you've discovered. Are you ready for that level of responsibility? I looked around the hangar at the aircraft I dedicated my career to maintaining, at the mechanics who were now looking to me for leadership in the investigation, and at the evidence that would expose a conspiracy against American national security. Sir, I replied, I've been ready for this my entire career. I just needed the opportunity to prove it. The power dynamic that had defined my experience at Crimson Ridge Air Base had been completely reversed. The mechanic who had been dismissed and undermined for months was now the expert witness whose evidence would drive a national security investigation. The supervisor who had wielded absolute authority over my career was under arrest for treason. And the aircraft that had been the target of sabotage were now under my protection. As the senior investigators began arriving in the hangar, I realized that this was just the beginning. The real scope of the conspiracy was about to be revealed, and I was going to be at the center of the investigation that exposed it. The helicopters that landed outside Hangar Bay 3 brought more than just senior investigators. They brought a complete transformation of everything I thought I knew about the scope of the conspiracy I'd uncovered. As personnel in civilian suits and military uniforms, bearing insignia I didn't immediately recognize filed into the hangar, I realized that my discovery of sabotage devices on a few F-22s was just the tip of an iceberg that extended far beyond. Crimson Ridge Air Base. The lead investigator introduced himself as Agent Marcus Sullivan from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, accompanied by Colonel Patricia Hayes from Air Force Office of Special Investigations and Dr. Rachel Chun, a civilian electronics specialist whose credentials apparently included classified work on advanced aircraft systems. Their immediate focus wasn't on congratulating me for exposing the conspiracy. It was on understanding how much damage had already been done. Specialist Rivera, Agent Sullivan began after reviewing the evidence I'd collected. We need to establish a complete timeline of when these devices were installed and what missions they might have compromised. But first, we need to get you out of here. The statement caught me off guard. Sir, I don't understand. I thought I was leading the technical investigation. You are, Colonel Hayes clarified, but not here. Your cover has been blown, and if this conspiracy is as extensive as we believe, remaining at Crimson Ridge puts you at significant risk. We're relocating you to a secure facility where you can continue your analysis without interference. Dr. Chun stepped forward with a tablet displaying technical schematics that made the devices I'd discovered look primitive by comparison. The sophistication of what you've found suggests coordination with advanced electronics manufacturing capabilities that exist in only a few countries. We need your expertise to trace the supply chain and identify additional targets. As the full implications of my situation began to sink in, Technical Sergeant Zoe Blackstone approached with the expression of concern mixed with admiration. Elena, she said quietly, I want you to know that what you did today took incredible courage. But I also want you to understand that this is going to change everything for you. You're not just a mechanic anymore, you're a key witness in a National security investigation. She was right, and I could already feel the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders. The simple desire to fix aircraft and protect pilots had evolved into something much larger and more complex. But as I looked around the hangar at the F-22s that represented the pinnacle of American aviation technology, I knew I couldn't walk away from seeing this through to its conclusion. "Before we leave," I said to Agent Sullivan, "there's something else you need to know." The person who was working with Lieutenant Commander Thornton, I never saw him clearly, but I have additional recordings that might help identify him. I pulled out a second device I'd kept hidden throughout the morning's confrontation, a more sophisticated recorder that had captured longer conversations over the past month. This contains evidence of at least 3 separate planning sessions, including discussions about other targets beyond the F-22 program. Dr. Chun's eyes widened as she realized the implications. Other aircraft programs? From what I overheard, this appears to be part of a broader effort targeting multiple advanced military systems. F-22s were just the beginning. Agent Sullivan immediately activated his secure communication device. "Control, this is Sullivan. We need immediate threat assessments on all advanced aircraft programs. Expand the investigation parameters to include potential sabotage across multiple platforms." As federal agents began coordinating what was clearly becoming a multi-base investigation, Colonel Hartwell approached me with orders that would formally change my status within the Air Force. "Specialist Rivera," he said, effective immediately. "You're being temporarily assigned to a joint task force investigating threats to critical defense systems. Your security clearance is being upgraded, and you'll have access to classified information necessary to support the investigation." The transformation was happening so quickly that I barely had time to process it. 24 hours earlier, I'd been a mechanic whose supervisor was trying to destroy her career. Now I was being read into classified programs and given authority to investigate potential threats to national security. But as preparations began for my departure from Crimson Ridge, I realized there was one more thing I needed to do. I walked over to Phoenix 7, the aircraft that had been intended as the centerpiece of the conspiracy against me, and placed my hand on its wing. The cool metal felt solid and reassuring, a reminder of why I'd chosen this career and what I was fighting to protect. "Take care of her," I said to Staff Sergeant Murphy, who had been assigned as interim supervisor of the squadron's maintenance operations. "And if you find anything unusual on any aircraft, anything at all, don't hesitate to report it immediately." "You can count on it," he replied. "And Rivera, thank you. You saved a lot of lives today." As I prepared to leave the hangar where my military career had nearly been destroyed and ultimately vindicated, Captain Diana Wu approached with a request that surprised me. "Specialist Rivera," she said, "I know you're being assigned to the investigation, but I want you to know that when this is over, I'd be honored to have you as my dedicated crew chief. A pilot needs to trust the people who maintain her aircraft. And after today, there's no one I'd trust more." The offer was extraordinary. Dedicated crew chiefs for F-22s were typically the most senior and experienced mechanics in the Air Force, positions that usually required years of proven performance and specialized training. To have it offered by one of the squadron's most respected pilots was recognition beyond anything I'd imagined possible. "Ma'am," I replied, "it would be an honor to work with you again." But even as I accepted her offer, I knew that my role in the Air Force was evolving beyond traditional maintenance positions. The investigation I was about to join would likely lead to opportunities and responsibilities that went far beyond working on individual aircraft. Agent Sullivan's team had completed their preliminary evidence collection and was ready to depart. As I gathered my personal belongings and the comprehensive documentation I'd compiled over months of investigation, I realized I was leaving Crimson Ridge as a completely different person than I'd been when I arrived 2 years earlier, the quiet mechanic who had been dismissed and undermined, was being replaced by a federal investigator whose expertise would help protect American military aviation from sophisticated foreign threats. The woman who had been told she didn't belong in fighter squadrons was now being recruited to help secure the most advanced aircraft in the world. "Ready, Specialist Rivera?" Agent Sullivan asked as his team prepared to board their helicopter. I took one last look around Hangar Bay 3, at the aircraft that had been my responsibility and the fellow mechanics who were now watching me leave, with expressions of respect and amazement. 6 months ago, they had barely acknowledged my presence. Now they were seeing me depart as part of a federal investigation team. "I'm ready," I replied, following the agents toward the helicopter that would take me to the next phase of my career. As the aircraft lifted off from Crimson Ridge Air Base and the hangar grew smaller below us, I reflected on the events that had brought me to this moment. My father had taught me that engines don't lie, and neither does the truth when you have the courage to speak it. Today I'd proven that principle at the highest levels of military operations. But I also realized that this departure wasn't an ending. It was a strategic withdrawal to a position where I could do even more damage to the conspiracy that threatened American aviation. The people who had tried to destroy my career had instead given me the platform to help protect national security. Sometimes, the greatest victories begin with walking away from the battlefield, but only after you've changed the rules of engagement. Completely in your favor, the secure facility where Agent Sullivan's team brought me was located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, home to the Air Force Research Laboratory and some of the most classified aerospace development programs in the United States. The nondescript building where I was escorted looked like a typical office complex from the outside, but the security measures and advanced electronics laboratories inside revealed its true purpose as a center for investigating threats to critical defense technologies. Over the next 72 hours, I watched as my evidence triggered a systematic dismantling of what investigators were calling Operation Tailspin, a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation that had been targeting American military aviation programs for over 2 years. What I discovered at Crimson Ridge was just one node in a network that extended across multiple air bases, defense contractors, and even civilian aerospace companies. Dr. Rachel Chun led me through a laboratory filled with electronic analysis equipment that made the tools available at Crimson Ridge look primitive by comparison. On examination tables throughout the room were dozens of devices similar to the ones I'd found recovered from aircraft at 7 different military installations across the country. "Your discovery was the breakthrough we needed," Dr. Chun explained, as she showed me circuit boards and components that had been extracted from F-22s, F-35 Lightning IIs, and even prototype aircraft I wasn't cleared to identify. We'd been seeing anomalous failures across multiple programs, but until you provided physical evidence of the sabotage devices, we couldn't prove deliberate interference. The scope of the operation was staggering. Using advanced computer analysis, investigators had traced the supply chain for the electronic components back to a defense contractor in Virginia that had been infiltrated by foreign operatives 18 months earlier. The company, Meridian Systems Integration, held contracts for maintenance support across dozens of military installations and had been systematically placing personnel in positions where they could access critical aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Thornton wasn't recruited at Crimson Ridge, Agent Sullivan explained during one of our daily briefings. He was specifically assigned there after being compromised during a previous deployment. His entire transfer to the F-22 program was orchestrated to give the operation access to our most advanced aircraft. But the systematic consequences of exposing the conspiracy extended far beyond identifying compromised personnel. My documentation had provided investigators with precise timestamps for when devices were installed, allowing them to cross-reference that information with flight schedules and identify every mission that had been potentially compromised. The results were sobering. Over the past 18 months, sabotage devices had affected at least 47 training missions and 12 operational deployments. 3 aircraft had experienced unexplained engine failures that had been attributed to mechanical problems, but were now revealed to be deliberate sabotage. Most disturbing of all, the devices had been activated during 2 overseas missions in regions where American aircraft were conducting sensitive reconnaissance operations. Captain Wu's mission wasn't just about testing your abilities as a scapegoat. Colonel Hayes revealed during a classified briefing that included personnel from the Pentagon and CIA. Phoenix 7 was scheduled to carry new sensor equipment on a deployment to the Pacific Theater next month. If the sabotage had succeeded during that mission, it would have compromised intelligence gathering operations and potentially cost lives in a combat zone. The investigation also revealed the true sophistication of the conspiracy's planning. The devices weren't just designed to cause failures, they were programmed to create specific types of problems that would discredit the affected aircraft programs. Engine failures during high-stress maneuvers would raise questions about design flaws. Sensor malfunctions during critical missions would suggest reliability problems. Even minor failures during routine operations were calculated to erode confidence. In American military aviation, they weren't trying to destroy individual aircraft, Dr. Chen explained as we analyzed data from recovered devices. They were trying to destroy faith in the technology itself. If Congress and military leadership lost confidence in the F-22 program, it would affect funding for next-generation aircraft development for decades. But my role in the investigation extended beyond providing evidence of past sabotage. The technical knowledge I gained from working on F-22 systems, combined with my ability to detect anomalies that other mechanics missed, made me invaluable. For developing countermeasures against future attacks, working with a team of Air Force engineers and civilian contractors, I helped design new security protocols for aircraft maintenance that would make it virtually impossible to install unauthorized devices without detection. The protocols included random inspections using handheld scanners that could identify foreign electronics, mandatory 2-person verification for all maintenance tasks involving critical systems, and continuous monitoring of aircraft performance data to detect subtle signs of tampering. Your father taught you to listen to what engines are telling you, Dr. Chen observed as we tested the new detection equipment on a specially modified F-22 engine. We're taking that same principle and applying it systematically across the entire fleet. The personal consequences of my involvement in the investigation were as dramatic as the operational changes being implemented. Within a week of arriving at Wright-Patterson, I received notification that I was being promoted to Staff Sergeant, with a commendation for exceptional service in protecting national security. The promotion came with assignment to the newly created Aerospace Security Division, where I would lead a team of mechanics trained specifically in detecting and countering sabotage attempts. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was watching the systematic dismantling of the network that had tried to destroy my career. Using the evidence I'd provided and additional intelligence gathered through surveillance operations, federal agents arrested 17 individuals involved in Operation Tailspin. The arrests included personnel at 5 different military installations, 3 employees of defense contractors, and 2 individuals who had been operating under diplomatic cover at foreign embassies. Lieutenant Commander Thornton, faced with overwhelming evidence of his involvement and the prospect of treason charges, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His debriefing sessions revealed the full scope of how foreign operatives had infiltrated American military maintenance operations, information that was being used to secure similar programs against future attacks. Thornton thought he was just following orders to advance his career, Agent Sullivan explained during one of our final briefings at Wright-Patterson. He didn't realize he was part of a comprehensive effort to undermine American air superiority. His cooperation is helping us identify other potential targets and strengthen security across the entire defense industrial base. The investigation also led to systematic reviews of personnel assigned to critical programs, resulting in the identification of 12 additional individuals who had been approached by foreign operatives, but hadn't yet been fully compromised. Rather than being prosecuted, these personnel were debriefed and reassigned to positions where they could continue serving without access to sensitive technologies. Your willingness to document everything and gather evidence methodically made this entire operation possible. Colonel Hayes told me as my temporary assignment at Wright-Patterson neared its end. Without your preparation and courage, we might never have discovered the full scope of the threat. As I prepared to return to operational duties with my new rank and responsibilities, I reflected on how completely the situation had been reversed. The conspiracy that was supposed to end my career had instead launched me into a position of greater responsibility and influence than I'd ever imagined possible. The people who had tried to use me as a scapegoat had instead given me the opportunity to help protect American military aviation at the highest levels. But the most important consequence wasn't personal, it was operational. The countermeasures we'd developed and the security protocols we'd implemented would protect not just current aircraft, but future generations of military aviation technology. The systematic response to Operation Tailspin had created a framework for detecting and countering similar threats before they could compromise American air superiority. The conspiracy had been methodically dismantled, its personnel arrested or reassigned, and its capabilities neutralized. But more importantly, the investigation had strengthened American aerospace security in ways that would protect pilots and aircraft for decades to come. 3 weeks into the investigation at Wright-Patterson, Agent Sullivan called me into a secure briefing room for what he described as the conversation that will change everything you thought you knew about this case. The room was equipped with the kind of advanced security measures that indicated whatever we were about to discuss operated at the highest levels of classification. Present were Dr. Chun, Colonel Hayes, and 2 individuals I hadn't met before: Deputy Director Sarah Martinez from the Defense Intelligence Agency and Dr. James Park, whose credentials were so heavily redacted that I could only determine he worked on advanced threat analysis for an agency that wasn't named. Staff Sergeant Rivera, Deputy Director Martinez began. What I'm about to tell you is compartmented information that fewer than 30 people in the entire government are cleared to access. Your role in exposing Operation Tailspin has earned you a place in this briefing, but it also makes you a permanent target of the intelligence services behind this conspiracy. The implications of that statement sent a chill through me, but I'd come too far to back down from the truth, regardless of its consequences. The sabotage operation you uncovered wasn't just about discrediting the F-22 program. Dr. Park continued, activating a secure display that showed intelligence assessments I'd never seen before. It was part of a comprehensive strategy to force the United States to question the fundamental principles underlying our approach to air superiority. What followed was a revelation that reframed everything I thought I understood about the conspiracy. I'd exposed. For the past 5 years, foreign intelligence services had been conducting what they called technical psychology operations against American military aviation programs. Rather than trying to steal technology or destroy aircraft directly, they were attempting to create systematic doubt about the reliability and effectiveness of advanced systems like the F-22, F-35, and classified next-generation platforms. The goal wasn't to cause crashes, Dr. Chun explained, displaying technical analysis that showed the sophisticated programming behind the sabotage devices. The goal was to create a pattern of unexplained failures that would gradually erode confidence in American aerospace technology. If military leadership and Congress began to doubt the reliability of these systems, funding for future development would be reduced, and our technological advantage would be undermined without a single shot being fired. The master plan was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. By creating artificial reliability problems across multiple aircraft programs simultaneously, foreign operatives hoped to trigger a crisis of confidence that would lead to reduced defense spending, canceled programs, and ultimately a shift in the global balance of air power. They studied our acquisition process, Deputy Director Martinez continued, and identified that our greatest vulnerability wasn't technological, it was political. American military programs are subject to congressional oversight, media scrutiny, and public opinion in ways that authoritarian systems aren't. If they could create enough doubt about the effectiveness of our most advanced aircraft, they could achieve through political pressure what they couldn't accomplish through military action. But what made the plan truly insidious was how it exploited the very openness and accountability that made American democracy strong. Every unexplained failure would be investigated by multiple agencies, reported by the media, and questioned by Congress. The resulting controversy would amplify the apparent problems far beyond their actual impact on operational capability. Lieutenant Commander Thornton was just one of dozens of assets they'd cultivated over years of patient intelligence work. Agent Sullivan revealed, showing me surveillance photos of personnel at multiple installations who had been identified as part of the conspiracy. They weren't recruiting people to steal secrets, they were recruiting people to create problems that would be attributed to American technological inadequacy. The recordings I'd made of Thornton's conversations had provided investigators with their first clear evidence of the coordination behind what appeared to be isolated incidents. But they had also revealed something even more significant. The operation was approaching its culmination phase. The conversation you recorded on accelerating the timeline wasn't just about discrediting you personally, Colonel Hayes explained. It was about implementing the final phase of their strategy. They were planning to trigger a series of simultaneous failures across multiple aircraft programs that would create a crisis of confidence in American military aviation. The scope of what they had planned was staggering. Over the course of 6 months, sabotage devices would have caused failures in F-22s, F-35s, and other critical aircraft during high-profile exercises and deployments. The failures would appear to be systemic problems with American technology, leading to congressional hearings, media investigations, and public questions about whether the United States was falling behind in military aviation. Your discovery of the devices disrupted their timeline completely, Dr. Park continued. Instead of appearing to be systemic failures, the problems were revealed to be deliberate sabotage. That transformed the narrative from American technology is unreliable to foreign adversaries are actively trying to undermine American capabilities. But the most significant revelation was still to come. The reason you were able to detect these devices when other mechanics missed them, Dr. Chun said, pulling up detailed analysis of my maintenance records, wasn't just because of your technical skills or your father's training. It was because you approached aircraft maintenance with a mindset that the foreign operatives hadn't anticipated. My insistence on documenting everything, my willingness to question authority when safety was concerned, and my systematic approach to investigating anomalies had created a detection capability that the conspiracy planners hadn't accounted for. They had infiltrated the official maintenance hierarchy, but they hadn't prepared for an individual mechanic who would maintain independent records and pursue unauthorized investigations. They assumed that military discipline and chain of command would prevent anyone from questioning officially approved procedures. Deputy Director Martinez explained, your willingness to challenge Lieutenant Commander Thornton's authority, even at risk to your career, exposed their entire operation. The master plan had depended on American mechanics following orders without question, accepting official explanations for unusual equipment, and trusting that their supervisors had their best interests at heart. My refusal to do any of those things had unraveled years of careful planning and exposed a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of American air superiority. But there's something else, Agent Sullivan said, his expression becoming even more serious. The intelligence we've gathered suggests that similar operations are being conducted against other critical defense programs. Your success in exposing Operation Tailspin has made you the template for a new approach to detecting and countering these threats. The briefing concluded with an offer that would fundamentally change the trajectory of my military career. The Defense Intelligence Agency was creating a new unit specifically designed to detect and counter technical psychology operations against critical defense programs. They wanted me to lead the team that would train personnel across the military to recognize and respond to similar threats. You've already proven that individual expertise and independent thinking can defeat sophisticated intelligence operations, Deputy Director Martinez said. We want to systematize that capability and deploy it across every critical program in the Department of Defense. As I sat in that secure briefing room, processing the full scope of what I'd uncovered and what I was being asked to do next, I realized that my father's lessons about listening to what engines tell you had evolved into something much larger. I hadn't just learned to detect mechanical problems. I'd learned to detect threats to the entire foundation of American military power. The master plan that was supposed to undermine American air superiority had instead created the framework for defending it more effectively than ever before. The conspiracy that tried to exploit American openness and accountability had instead demonstrated the strength that comes from empowering individuals to think independently and act courageously. My journey from dismissed mechanic to national security asset was complete, but my real work was just beginning. 6 months after the initial arrests at Crimson Ridge, I received a classified intelligence briefing that detailed the complete collapse of the foreign intelligence network I'd helped expose. The systematic investigation that followed my discovery had created a domino effect that reached far beyond anything the original planners had anticipated, destroying careers, compromising operations, and forcing a fundamental restructuring of how foreign adversaries approached intelligence operations against American military programs. The briefing took place at the Pentagon, in a secure facility where I now regularly consulted on aerospace security matters as part of my new role leading the Technical Threat Detection Unit. Deputy Director Martinez presented the intelligence assessment with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a carefully planned enemy operation collapse under its own weight. The network you exposed has been completely dismantled, she began, displaying an organizational chart that showed the connections between personnel across multiple countries and agencies. 17 arrests in the United States, 43 expulsions of diplomatic personnel, and the closure of 3 front companies that were providing technical support for the operation. But the real damage to the foreign intelligence operation went far beyond the immediate arrests and expulsions. The exposure of Operation Tailspin had forced enemy intelligence services to abandon years of careful preparation and investment in what they had considered their most promising approach to undermining American military capabilities. The technical psychology operation concept required long-term placement of assets in positions where they could gradually build credibility and access. Dr. Park explained, showing me classified assessments of how foreign intelligence services were struggling to adapt to the new security measures we'd implemented. Your exposure of their methods has made it virtually impossible for them to rebuild similar capabilities. The consequences for the individuals who had been recruited into the conspiracy were particularly severe. Lieutenant Commander Thornton, despite his cooperation with investigators, had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and dismissed from the Air Force with loss of all benefits. His military career, which had spanned 2 decades and included multiple deployments, was erased completely. Thornton's case has become a cautionary tale that we're using in security training across the Department of Defense. Agent Sullivan reported during one of our regular coordination meetings. His progression from trusted supervisor to foreign asset demonstrates How gradually intelligence services can compromise personnel who don't recognize the warning signs. But Thornton's downfall was just the beginning of a cascade of consequences that affected dozens of individuals who had been associated with Operation Tailspin. 3 other military supervisors at different installations had been arrested for similar activities, their careers destroyed and their families devastated by the revelation of their involvement in activities that bordered on treason. The civilian contractors who had provided technical support for the operation faced even worse consequences. Meridian Systems Integration, the defense contractor that had been infiltrated by foreign operatives, was forced into bankruptcy when the Pentagon canceled all of its contracts and banned it from future government work. Over 400 employees lost their jobs, and several executives faced criminal prosecution for their role in enabling foreign access to classified programs. The collapse of Meridian has sent shockwaves through the entire defense contractor community, Colonel Hayes explained during a briefing on industry security measures. Every company with access to classified programs is now reviewing their personnel security procedures and implementing additional safeguards to prevent similar infiltration. The foreign intelligence operatives who had orchestrated the conspiracy faced their own professional catastrophe. The individuals I had recorded during their planning sessions with Thornton had been identified through voice analysis and other technical means, leading to their expulsion from the United States and the exposure of their entire intelligence network. The operative who was coordinating with Thornton has been identified as Senior Colonel Victor Petrov of the GRU. Deputy Director Martinez revealed during a classified briefing that included intelligence officials from multiple agencies. His exposure has compromised Russian intelligence operations across multiple countries and forced them to recall dozens of operatives whose identities were connected to his network. But the most significant consequence was the complete failure of the strategic objectives that Operation Tailspin was designed to achieve. Instead of creating doubt about American military aviation, the exposure of the sabotage conspiracy had actually strengthened confidence in American technology and security procedures. Congressional funding for the F-22 program has increased by 30% since your discovery, Dr. Chun reported with evident satisfaction. Legislators who were previously skeptical about the aircraft's reliability are now viewing it as a target of foreign interference, which has actually increased their support for the program. The political impact extended far beyond funding decisions. The revelation that foreign adversaries had invested years of effort and significant resources in trying to undermine American military aviation had triggered a bipartisan response that strengthened support for defense technology development across multiple programs. Your investigation has been cited in congressional testimony as evidence that American military technology is so advanced that our adversaries can't compete directly. They have to resort to sabotage and deception, Deputy Director Martinez explained. That's exactly the opposite of what Operation Tailspin was intended to achieve. The failure of the conspiracy had also forced foreign intelligence services to fundamentally reconsider their approach to targeting American military capabilities. Intelligence assessments indicated that they were abandoning technical psychology operations in favor of more traditional espionage methods, which were easier to detect and counter using established security procedures. The sophisticated approach they developed specifically to exploit American political and media systems has been discredited within their own intelligence community, Dr. Park reported. Internal communications we've intercepted suggest they're returning to conventional intelligence gathering, which is much less threatening to our operational capabilities. The professional consequences for enemy intelligence personnel extended beyond immediate operational failures. Several individuals who had been involved in planning Operation Tailspin had been recalled to their home countries and faced career-ending reviews for their role in a strategy that had not only failed but had actually strengthened American military capabilities. Intelligence services don't forgive failure on this scale, Agent Sullivan explained. The personnel who designed and implemented this operation have been professionally destroyed within their own organizations. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was watching the complete reversal of fortune for the people who had tried to destroy my career as part of their larger conspiracy. The individuals who had planned to use me as a scapegoat for their sabotage operations were now facing criminal prosecution, professional disgrace, and personal ruin. The irony is perfect, Colonel Hayes observed during one of our final debriefings on Operation Tailspin. They tried to destroy your credibility to hide their activities, but instead they gave you the platform to expose their entire network and advance your career beyond anything you could have achieved through normal channels. As I reviewed the comprehensive intelligence assessment that documented the complete collapse of the conspiracy I'd exposed, I realized that the downward spiral of consequences had extended far beyond anything the original planners could have anticipated. Their sophisticated strategy had not only failed, it had created the exact opposite of their intended results. The network that was supposed to undermine American air superiority had instead strengthened it. The individuals who planned to advance their careers through foreign intelligence collaboration had destroyed them completely. And the mechanic they had tried to use as a scapegoat had become the architect of their downfall. Sometimes the most sophisticated plans fail not because of external opposition, but because they underestimate the power of individual integrity and professional competence. Operation Tailspin had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, brought down by a mechanic from Kansas who simply refused to ignore what her training told her was wrong. 2 years after the Phoenix 7 incident that changed everything, I stood in the hangar at Edwards Air Force Base in California, watching the rollout of the first F-22 Raptor equipped with the advanced threat detection system technology that had been developed directly from the lessons learned during Operation Tailspin. The aircraft gleamed under the hangar lights, its familiar angular profile now enhanced with subtle modifications that represented the evolution of American aerospace security. The ceremony was attended by senior officials from across the Department of Defense, congressional representatives, and aerospace industry leaders who had worked to implement the comprehensive security reforms that emerged from my investigation. But the person whose presence meant the most to me was Technical Sergeant, now Master Sergeant Zoe Blackstone, who had flown in from her new assignment at the Pentagon's Aerospace Security Division. "Elena," she said as we watched the ceremonial unveiling, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stayed late that weekend to work on Phoenix 7? The question had occurred to me many times over the past 2 years. If I had simply accepted Lieutenant Commander Thornton's dismissal of the Thunder 5 oil sample, if I had followed his orders without question, if I had been willing to overlook the anomalies I detected, Operation Tailspin would have succeeded beyond its planners' wildest expectations. "I think about my father," I replied. "He taught me that engines don't lie, and neither does the truth when you have the courage to speak it." Everything else followed from that principle. The truth was that the 2 years since exposing the conspiracy had transformed not just my career, but my understanding of what it meant to serve in the military. My new position as Director of Technical Threat Assessment had given me responsibilities I never could have imagined when I was working on crop dusters in Kansas. But it had also shown me how individual actions could have consequences that rippled through entire institutions. The advanced threat detection system being unveiled that day was just one example of how the lessons from Operation Tailspin had been systematized and deployed across American military aviation. Every F-22, F-35, and next-generation aircraft now carried sensors that could detect unauthorized electronic devices, monitor performance parameters for signs of tampering, and alert maintenance personnel to potential sabotage attempts. The system you helped design has already prevented 17 attempted sabotage operations across 8 different installations, Colonel Hayes reported during the technical briefing that followed the ceremony. Foreign intelligence services have essentially abandoned technical infiltration as a viable strategy against American aerospace programs. But the changes extended far beyond technology. The investigation I had triggered had led to a complete restructuring of how the Air Force approached personnel security, maintenance protocols, and threat detection across all critical programs. The most significant change was the implementation of what became known as the Rivera Protocol's procedures that encouraged individual mechanics and technicians to question unusual equipment, report anomalies through independent channels, and maintain personal documentation of their observations. The protocols were named after me, but they represented a fundamental shift toward empowering individual expertise rather than relying solely on hierarchical authority. Your willingness to challenge authority when safety was at stake has become the model for how we train personnel across all critical programs. Deputy Director Martinez explained during a ceremony where I received the Defense Intelligence Agency's highest civilian award. The Rivera Protocols have been adopted by every service branch and are being implemented by allied nations around the world. The personal transformation had been equally dramatic. My promotion to major, an unprecedented jump for someone with my background, had come with assignment to lead a joint task force that worked with allies to identify and counter similar threats to their aerospace programs. The mechanic who had been dismissed and undermined at Crimson Ridge was now briefing senior officials from NATO countries on advanced security procedures. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Captain Deanna Wu, now Lieutenant Colonel Wu, had been promoted to squadron commander at Moody Air Force Base, where she was implementing advanced pilot safety programs based on the lessons learned from Operation Tailspin. "Elena," she said during a visit to Edwards, "I want you to know that every time I fly, I think about what you did that day in the hangar. You didn't just save my life, you saved the entire principle of American air superiority." The redemption aspect of the story wasn't limited to my own career advancement. Even some of the individuals who had been caught up in Operation Tailspin had found opportunities for rehabilitation and second chances. Staff Sergeant Murphy, who had initially been suspicious of my technical assessments, had become one of the most effective instructors in the new threat detection training program. His experience witnessing the conspiracy's exposure from the inside gave him unique credibility when teaching other mechanics to recognize and report suspicious activities. I learned that questioning authority isn't insubordination when safety and security are at stake, he said during a training session I observed at Lackland Air Force Base. Elena Rivera taught all of us that individual responsibility doesn't end just because someone with higher rank tells you to ignore a problem. The growth wasn't limited to military personnel. The defense contractor community had undergone its own transformation in response to the lessons learned from Operation Tailspin. New security protocols, enhanced background investigations, and regular audits had made it much more difficult for foreign operatives to infiltrate companies with access to classified programs. Even some of the lower-level personnel who had been unknowingly involved in supporting the conspiracy had been given opportunities to contribute to the improved security measures. Their insights into how they had been manipulated helped investigators develop better training programs for recognizing and resisting foreign intelligence recruitment attempts. Redemption isn't just about individual second chances, Dr. Chun explained during a conference on aerospace security where I was the keynote speaker. It's about institutional learning and the willingness to admit that our systems had vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. The international impact had been equally significant. The techniques we developed for detecting and countering technical psychology operations had been shared with allied nations, strengthening the security of aerospace programs across the democratic world. Several countries had reported discovering and dismantling similar foreign intelligence operations using methods derived from the Operation Tailspin investigation. Your investigation has become a case study in how individual courage and professional competence can defeat sophisticated intelligence operations. A British intelligence official told me during a NATO security conference, "The principles you demonstrated are being taught to security personnel across multiple countries." As I reflected on the journey from that morning in Hangar Bay 3 to my current position, briefing senior officials on international aerospace security, I realized that the growth had been about much more than career advancement or institutional reform. It had been about proving that the values my father taught me in a converted barn in Kansas, integrity, attention to detail, and the courage to speak truth to power, were not just personal principles, but strategic assets in defending American security. The mechanic who had been told she didn't belong in fighter squadrons was now helping to secure the future of American military aviation. The woman who had been used as a pawn in a foreign intelligence operation had become the architect of defenses against similar threats. And the Air Force that had nearly lost one of its most advanced aircraft to sabotage had emerged stronger and more secure than ever before, standing in that hangar at Edwards, watching the next generation of F-22 technology that incorporated lessons learned from the darkest moment of my career. I understood that sometimes the greatest growth comes not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them with absolute commitment to doing what's right, regardless of the personal cost. 5 years after that morning, when I dropped a wrench in Hangar Bay 3 and watched my world transform, I found myself standing before a joint session of Congress, delivering testimony that would shape the future of American aerospace security for generations to come. The mahogany-paneled chamber was filled with representatives and senators who held the power to fund or cancel the military programs that defended our nation. And they were listening intently as I explained how a mechanic's willingness to question authority had exposed the most sophisticated intelligence threat in modern American history. "Members of Congress," I began, looking across the assembly of lawmakers whose decisions would determine whether the lessons of Operation Tailspin would be permanently integrated into American defense policy. The story I'm here to tell is not just about aircraft maintenance or foreign espionage. It's about the fundamental principle that individual integrity and professional competence are the strongest defenses against any threat to our national security. The transformation from Staff Sergeant Elena Rivera to Major Elena Rivera, Director of Global Aerospace Threat Assessment, represented more than career advancement. It represented a complete redefinition of how America approaches the protection of its most critical technologies. The success I had achieved wasn't measured in rank or recognition, but in the systematic changes that now protected every pilot who flew American aircraft and every program that pushed the boundaries of aerospace innovation. Over the past 5 years, the Technical Threat Detection Unit I had founded had grown from a small team at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to an international organization with personnel stationed at allied installations around the world. We had identified and neutralized 43 separate foreign intelligence operations targeting aerospace programs, prevented an estimated $200 billion in research and development losses, and established security protocols that had been adopted by every major democratic nation. The most important lesson we learned, I continued in my congressional testimony, is that sophisticated threats require sophisticated responses, but they also require something much simpler: the willingness of individual professionals to trust their training, document their observations, and speak up when something doesn't seem right. The Rivera protocols had evolved far beyond their original conception as maintenance procedures for detecting sabotage devices. They had become a comprehensive framework for empowering individual expertise at every level of military and civilian organizations. Personnel from maintenance technicians to senior engineers were now trained to recognize, document, and report anomalies through independent channels that bypass traditional hierarchical structures. We've discovered that the most effective defense against foreign intelligence operations isn't technology or regulation, Dr. Chun explained during the joint panel discussion we conducted for military leaders from 23 allied nations. It's creating a culture where individual competence and integrity are valued more highly than compliance with authority. The philosophical implications of this discovery extended far beyond aerospace security. The principles that had guided my investigation of Operation Tailspin's systematic documentation, independent verification, and the courage to challenge authority when evidence demanded it had applications across every aspect of national defense and democratic governance. My foundation, the Rivera Institute for Technical Integrity, had been established with support from the Department of Defense and private donors to research and promote these principles in civilian industries as well as military applications. We were working with companies in sectors ranging from nuclear power to cybersecurity to develop frameworks for detecting and countering sophisticated threats that exploited human psychology and institutional vulnerabilities. Elena Rivera has shown us that the greatest weapon any democracy possesses is not technological superiority or military strength, Senator Patricia Whitman said during the congressional hearing, but the willingness of individual citizens to take personal responsibility for protecting the institutions and values they serve. But the most profound transformation had been personal. The scared mechanic who had worried about questioning Lieutenant Commander Thornton's authority had evolved into someone who regularly briefed heads of state and senior military leaders from around the world. The woman who had been told she didn't belong in fighter squadrons was now helping to design the security architecture that would protect aerospace programs for decades to come. The journey had taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act according to your principles, even when the consequences are uncertain. Every decision I had made during the Operation Tailspin investigation, from maintaining independent records to challenging authority to recording conversations, had been driven by the simple conviction that protecting pilots and aircraft was more important than protecting my career. The greatest victories are not won through superior force or advanced technology, I told a gathering of young Air Force Academy cadets during a leadership seminar, but through the daily decision to do what's right even when it's difficult, to seek truth even when it's inconvenient, and to speak up even when it's dangerous. The impact on my family legacy had been equally profound. The Rivera Aviation Services hangar in Millbrook, Kansas, had been restored and converted into a training center where young mechanics learned both technical skills and the ethical principles that my father had taught me decades earlier. The center had become a pilgrimage site for aerospace professionals who wanted to understand how individual integrity could defend national security. Your father would be proud, my cousin Maria told me during the dedication ceremony for the training center. He always said that good mechanics listen to what engines tell them, but you've shown that great mechanics listen to what their conscience tells them too. The international recognition had been gratifying, but the most meaningful acknowledgement came from the pilots whose lives had been protected by the security measures we'd implemented. Lieutenant Colonel Diana Wu, now a general commanding an entire fighter wing, had written in her recommendation for my promotion to colonel that Major Rivera didn't just save my aircraft, she saved the principle that individual excellence and moral courage are the foundation of American military strength. Looking back on the path that had brought me from a converted barn in Kansas to congressional testimony rooms in Washington, I realized that the greatest lesson wasn't about detecting sabotage or exposing conspiracies. It was about the transformative power of refusing to accept that things are the way they have to be simply because that's the way they've always been. The foreign intelligence services that had spent years developing Operation Tailspin had made a fundamental miscalculation about American character. They had assumed that military discipline and hierarchical authority would prevent individual mechanics from questioning official procedures or investigating anomalies independently. They had underestimated the willingness of someone raised on American principles of individual responsibility and democratic accountability to risk everything in defense of those principles. The greatest threats to democracy don't come from external enemies, I concluded in my congressional testimony. They come from internal acceptance of authority without question, compliance without verification, and silence in the face of evidence that demands action. The most sophisticated intelligence operation in history was defeated not by advanced technology or massive resources, but by a mechanic who refused to ignore what her training told her was wrong. As I stepped down from the witness table and walked out of the congressional chamber, I thought about my father's words echoing across the years. Engines don't lie, and neither does the truth when you have the courage to speak it. That simple principle, learned in a crop dusting operation in rural Kansas, had evolved into a philosophy that now protected the most advanced aerospace programs in the world. The journey from mechanic to major, from maintenance bay to congressional hearing room, from dismissed expertise to international recognition, had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by generals or politicians, but by individuals who simply refuse to compromise their integrity, regardless of the cost. The greatest revenge against those who tried to destroy my career wasn't my success. It was the demonstration that the values they had tried to exploit were actually the source of America's greatest strength. Sometimes the most profound victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from proving that the principles they attacked were worth defending all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.